you're all just ashes and particles now, that your body won't be like, resurrected when the time comes. But if one's body, even if you're buried normally as a body, though, your body is already like technically, I don't know what's it called? Decomposing, and your body's already not fully a body. So I'm wondering how much different is, like, if your body, like the people who have been buried for thousands of years are
very much in terms of technicalities. Yeah, who knows, right? But if you follow the Jewish understanding of the way that the resurrection worked, so specifically the Pharisees believe that there'd be a resurrection, right, at the time of Jesus. And you go back to Ezekiel, and there is a very interesting story in Ezekiel where there is a valley of, very famous story in Ezekiel, there's a whole valley, there's a huge valley full of bones, dry bones. You guys, how many are familiar with that story? Valley of the dry bones. Oh my gosh.
Sorry, I'm a heathen.
You guys, this is why Sunday school is important for kids. That way you learn all these stories. And that way when you get to be an adult, then you can say, oh, I see how that story fits. Okay, so there's a whole valley full of dry bones. Ezekiel sees this, right? There's a whole valley full of dry bones. And then what starts happening with the bones? Since you don't know the story, I'll just tell you. The bones start shaking and quaking. And then they start like coming back together and hooking up. And then there's just a whole valley full of skeletons now. And then there's flesh that starts growing back over the top of the bones and connecting these things all back together. And so now you've got a whole field full of dead people. And then there's breath that enters the bodies, and they all come back to life. Okay? This is historically sort of understood to be a picture of not just what happens to Israel, that'd be specifically, but Christians have understood this is what happens to the body, right? Where your bones, but the bones come back together and flesh grows on top of them, and then there's given life. But I mean, simply if you're following in the footsteps of Jesus, was Jesus cremated? No. Does Paul talk about there being that we follow Christ into death and follow him out again alive bodily? Yes, he does, constantly. This is the hope for Christians. And so anyway, that is something that our culture, as it's moving further and further away from sort of like a historic Christian understanding of things, is shying away now from that, and it's embracing more of what we would consider, at least historically, to be pagan burial practices like cremation. Who knows? Maybe 200 years from now, we'll be eating our parents. Bon appetit. It's like the Donner Party all over again. Yep. So, and by the way, you guys are familiar with the Donner Party, I'm assuming? Yes? First night when they ate somebody, Christmas Eve. Yep. Don't worry, they didn't kill him first, at least probably not. They let him die and then they ate him. Okay, anyway, happier things from here on out. So, so there's the argument, right? That we are basically taught customs within our culture, and no matter what we think, so I just made a very brief argument as to why burial, as for a Christian, is better than cremation. Right? I just kind of made that argument for you, that we ought to bury our dead because Jesus was buried. And as he rose again bodily, so too that we as Christians, we have 2,000 years of Christian tradition to support this. In addition to Paul only talking in that language and not talking at all in terms of cremation. My guess is, though, that the vast majority of you haven't really changed your view on cremation. You're still like, yeah, even though your grandma would have been horrified or your great-grandma would have been horrified at it.
My brother would be horrified.
Your brother would be horrified.
He yelled at
your brother is a Mr. Cook in training.
He yelled at my mom for wanting to be cremated.
Oh, all right. So Sophie's heard the arguments, I guess. So outside of, but the rest of you.
I knew it because we've had fights in the car about my brother being like, I can't believe you would ever think about being cremated. And he was just like going off at her.
Yeah, so there you go. in Sophie's family, they've heard the arguments and have embraced the historic Christian idea. But my guess is the vast majority of you haven't changed your ideas. I've given you good arguments, biblical arguments, historical arguments, arguments that make sense, and to the suggestion that cremation doesn't make sense for Christians. And my guess is none of you have changed your view. Why? Because you have been enculturated into our culture. You don't change your mind based on arguments and reason. You change it based on how you feel and how you've been conditioned. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And we're asking the question, why do we tend to not necessarily follow reason, but why do we tend to believe the same things, right? All of us kind of, and as much as intellectually as I have a problem potentially with cremation, emotionally, I'm good with it. Why am I emotionally good with it? Because I have been conditioned. There's a great little video here that's going to tell us right about exactly about conditioning. I think you're going to love it, and I really hope. Actually, you know what? I'm going to pause my recording here just so that YouTube doesn't kick this off. So how many of you guys had seen that clip of Jim and Dwight before? Okay, so that is an example of what we call conditioning. To what extent are we conditioned in order to fit into society? Here we have Jim conditioning Dwight to, at the sound of his computer shutting down, he gets fed an Altoid. And so after a while, he begins to associate the sound of the computer shutting down with the Altoid. And the question is this something that actually is really possible? And it's true. The scientist that Jim learned about, that he discussed in the clip, his name was Pavlov. And we're going to take a look at what Pavlov did in order to question whether or not what he calls classical conditioning is real. And then we'll ask kind of a terrible question. So you can do this with the animals that Pavlov used. But what about if you try it with humans? So sharing screen again here with you guys. And we are going to do that. And then we're going to do this. And now we're asking the question, why do you and I tend to have the same feelings? In fact, when it comes down to it, things like with cremation, right? I might have one position and you might have another position, but the chances are we have the exact same feelings about it. It's kind of like, you know, it's fine, whatever. So why? Because we have been conditioned. Pavlov argued that this was a possibility, and then he conducted a scientific experiment, not on human beings, but rather with dogs. What he did was he took a tuning fork. Of course, a little tuning fork is rung in order to tune various musical instruments. But what he would do is he'd ring the tuning fork and then feed the dogs food so that the dogs began to associate the noise, the sound of the tuning fork, with the food that was being fed to the dogs. And then after several weeks of this, he was wondering what it would look like, what would happen with the dogs. And so he rang the tuning fork, and then the dogs would go crazy. They expect their food. You know, when the noise happens, the food happens. And so they'd be slobbering and drooling all over the place. They'd be salivating, wanting their food, because they began to associate with what is known as classical conditioning, the food with the sound of the tuning fork. Now you might be saying, and you probably should be saying, okay, Mr. Cook, that might be true for dogs, but dogs are simple animals. Human beings are far more complex creatures than our dogs. Human beings are far more intelligent than dogs and are much less apt to be conditioned in a similar fashion. Now, you might say that, well, that is obvious. Maybe the conditioning that happens for us is more nuanced, and I would say generally it is. But believe it or not, before they actually had rules against this, it was tried. The little boy's name, Albert. Little Albert was conditioned to be absolutely freaked out about white things. Let's talk about little Albert here. Here he is. Santa Claus is there in the corner with his big white bushy beard, and poor little Albert is getting physically sick. How did they condition this poor little kid to be absolutely freaked out about everything white? Well, what they would do is they would take huge symbols and crash them together behind poor little Albert's head every time he got close to anything fuzzy and white. So they'd stick a little fuzzy stuffed animal in there, and he'd go towards the stuffed animal, it'd be white, crash over his head, and it would freak him out. And then they would take like a real bunny rabbit and put the bunny rabbit in. The bunny rabbit hops towards him, and at first he goes towards the bunny rabbit, but then after conditioning, when the bunny rabbit would come toward him, he would freak out and try to get away from the rabbit and become physically ill. Taking little white cotton balls, throw a little white cotton ball in there, same thing. He was conditioned to be absolutely freaked out about all things white. So now he fears even Santa Claus. We don't really know what happened to little Albert. It is a mystery. Chances are he did not grow up to be a happy, well-adjusted child. But who knows? So this happens with human beings. Yes, it does. How many of you are a little bit disturbed that they actually did this to a human baby?
It's barbaric.
How many of you say it's barbaric? How many of you are like, you know what? It's for the greater good. Sometimes you got to ruin a kid's life, but we know the truth now. How many of you are all for that? Anybody? Oh, come on, guys. It's for the greater good. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a kid in order to know what's going on, right? No, sorry, I was not being a relativist. I was being a utilitarian. I apologize, but only somewhat. So then the question is, how have we been conditioned? If you can condition little Albert this way and dogs that way, have we been conditioned? Let me just say yes. You guys think that what you are doing right now in school is simply schoolwork and learning to learn these ideas and take these things maybe into your adulthood and use them in a functional way. But it's far more than that. You have been being conditioned and being punished and rewarded ever since the time you were little Albert's age. Not necessarily to fear white things. In fact, hopefully you don't fear white things and you don't have arbitrary fears. Although my guess is some of us probably have these arbitrary fears because people don't condition absolutely perfectly evenly. That's why we spend so much time conditioning you. That's part of my job. It's not my job description, but that is absolutely the case. I am conditioning you. Your parents have been conditioning you since the day you were born. Are human beings naturally kind and cooperative? Look at this picture of this little boy and this little girl here sharing a book. But is that natural? You know deep down that little girl wants to rip the book away from the boy and punch him in the face. You know it's true. But that's not what we reward in our society. In fact, when we see an image like this, we have been conditioned to feel positively toward this image. Little boy and little girl sharing with each other. But some of you probably have very few natural positive inclinations towards this. Rather, your inclinations have been conditioned to appreciate this if you do. And if you don't appreciate it, well, you're not going to say it out loud because you've been conditioned by society. Okay, how about this? Are the kids rewarded here for behaving so nastily and badly? No, they're not being rewarded. In fact, if their parents see them doing this, chances are the parents will do what? Keep them from fighting and then pull the belt off and beat the kids. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes, how many of you are like, yeah, sometimes you got to beat your kids. You got, if you can't reward them into good behavior, then you beat them out of the bad behavior. Let me hear, see, Let me see your hands. I mean, it's like, yeah, sometimes you got to beat your kids. I'm saying like spank them. I'm not saying actually beat them.
Yeah.
How many of you are like, no, you do not condition with negative reinforcement. You only condition with positive reinforcement. Anybody?
That's stupid.
That's what?
Stupid. Doesn't
So
work.
you have to condition with both?
Yeah.
But you guys see what I'm saying here? That was, by the way, a complex question. Did you guys catch that? I just pulled
Yeah.
a fallacy on you. How many caught my fallacy? Did anyone catch my fallacy? Did you mention that to, did you mention that to Anna?
No, she
mentioned it.
mentioned it.
Yeah, all
I was
right.
pointing at her.
Yeah, my complex question for you guys. Yeah, I'm basically trying to get you to assume that conditioning works and does work this way. Oh, guys, isn't that cute? Look at them. Now, when I have all boys in my class and we're doing this slideshow in person, usually I put that on, they just shrug. They're like, yeah, whatever. But and this is just generally speaking, now maybe you're a girl who hates kids, I don't know. But most girls don't, and they see this and they go, oh, guys, we've been conditioned to think that this sort of kind, loving behavior is good, and this sort of behavior isn't good. Kids, you're going down. You know what I'm saying? Sophie, how many do you think that we ought to beat those kids there? Do those kids need a little whooping?
A little.
Just a little whooping. Okay. Oh, look at that. Oh, isn't that so great? Guys, we've been conditioned to think this is good. How many of you have ever wanted to smack your sibling in the face? Yeah, if you have a sibling. If you don't have a sibling, how many of you could imagine wanting to smack your make-believe sibling in the face? Okay, well. Oh, look at this one. This is hilarious. However, is this sort of behavior rewarded? Keep it up, kids. Hey, if you guys keep fighting like this, you're going to have ice cream when you get home. Your parents don't say that, right? They say, stop fighting. And they'll say, if you're
Stop,
good,
sissy,
you
you
can have
got
ice
it.
cream when you get home. This is not good. Mom and dad have been conditioning you. And I have been conditioning you. And school has been conditioning you. If you guys can remember back to the good old days when we used to meet in person, do you remember the bell system that we used to have? How many of you remember the bell system? Where the
It's
bell
really-
would go off and it would tell you it's time to move from one class to another class? How many of you remember how difficult on a typical day or on a chapel day, how difficult fifth period, I guess it would be most any day, depending on how the schedule was organized. But do you remember those days? And I think it was primarily chapel days that confused people because they'd be in a class that they would normally be in right before lunch. And remember the junior high bell would go off and it would go off in fifth period to dismiss the junior high, not you. Do you guys realize that my students, every time, and you know it's true if you think about it, because you've been conditioned by the bells. Bell rings before lunch, that means you get up and you go eat food. However, on those chapel days, that bell would ring for junior high, and then it would ring like 3 times before it actually let you out. And every time my students always did this, like they're gonna get up. Bell rings, oh no, it's not. 5 minutes later, bell rings again. Because you've been conditioned to move when you hear the bell. How many of you realize that that is true? So conditioning works. By the way, conditioning keeps happening all through our lives. Now, we're not doing this anymore because we've decided that George Washington was a slave owner and he's evil. So now he just looks like a hypocrite praying in the snow. But 20 years ago, people still reverence George Washington. Here he is praying in the snow with his horse, also praying. Something tells me when you see this image, you don't have the same feelings you had when you saw this image. This image is probably more positive for you than this image. How many of you would say that that is true? This image was more positive than this image? We've been conditioned, ladies and gentlemen, to feel that. Oh, look at that. Now, of course, you might look at this picture and say that that's kind of stupid, and I would too, because I mean, do adults really like that? I would be thinking this picture is stupid. Why am I here? How many of you though you look at that and you're like, oh, that's kind of a nice picture, you know? It's at least it shows artificial joy and this sort of thing. How many of you are at the very least not offended by the picture? How many of you are not offended by the picture? Okay. Yeah, is this the case? How many of you are like, Ian, are you slightly offended by this picture?
I'm extremely offended by this picture.
Extremely offended by this. Okay, how about this picture? In class, just, you guys don't get to have the typical experience of this, by the way, because you're not in class. But in class, as we're walking through this, oftentimes people are sort of having a good time and joking quite a bit, you know, about the pictures and, you know, especially the little kids smiling and hugging. And it's kind of a light time to show the picture of the stupid adults standing there all being happy. And then all of a sudden I show this picture, and it's like somebody drains the room of joy. Like everyone immediately shuts up and is like somewhat horrified. Why? Conditioning. You've been conditioned to see an image like this and feel horror and to feel disgust. In fact, some of you might feel, as Kuhlander would point out, disgust so wrongly that you'd look at an image like this and said what the Nazis did was what?
Evil.
Evil. Abraham Lincoln. How do you guys feel about Abraham Lincoln? Now, I know some of you may have been watching some of the Black Lives Matter protests here lately go a bit unhinged, right? So let's tear down the statue of Abraham Lincoln. Why? Because he freed those black slaves? I don't know. It doesn't follow in my reasoning. I can't figure out why you'd tear down his statue for freeing the slaves, but you know, I guess they can knock themselves out with statues. But when we see it, so let me see, how many of you kind of like Abraham Lincoln? You're like, yep, when I see Abraham Lincoln's image, I feel at least some degree of fondness. When he was elected president, Ian, no? Abraham Lincoln just kind of meh for you? You don't have any emotions about Abraham Lincoln. Ian, you're not being conditioned very well here. How can we get your conditioning back on track?
Maybe if you did a better job at your job, Mr. Cook, this wouldn't have turned out this way.
Yeah, maybe so. I should have taught you to bow down at the altar of Abraham Lincoln a little bit better. Okay, so when he was, now of course we see him, we have positive feelings. He was considered so incredibly ugly. Big sniffing nose, flapping ears, a leathery face with warts. He was in fact so ugly that when he was elected president of the United States, a young girl wrote him a letter. And in the letter, she suggested he grow a beard to cover it up. He did so. Abraham Lincoln is not the most attractive guy to walk the face of the planet, yet we seem to think of him quite positively. Okay. Now, of course, how are we conditioned to feel about Jesus? Now, this picture, of course, for the vast majority of you probably doesn't do much. Why? Because you're good Protestants, and Protestants don't like pictures. Art, we don't like it. What do we like our churches to look like? Big buildings that have lots of white paint and no art whatsoever. And so if you're Catholic, though, you might look at an image like this and feel some sort of positive feeling towards the image. But rather than, for most of you, using the image to ask yourself the question, how have I been conditioned to feel about Jesus? Let's ask ourselves the question, for those of you how many of you kind of like worship music? I'm not going to ridicule you, by the way. That's fine. Okay. Yes, we're not doing a very, so some of you are doing this with the worship music stuff. Okay, so we're clearly not doing a good job conditioning you for the religion of Christianity. We need to come up with a better route. When I was a kid though, that worship music was the thing, and everyone was like, and the kids too, and everyone but me, I was kind of like, I don't know about this stuff. It's kind of weird. But people were conditioned very well. And so when the worship music comes on, like, oh, the emotion, I mean, we've been conditioned to love it, to, you know, you zoom me out onto the waters where my feet may fail. Is that how the song goes?
I'm pretty sure it's a little bit different, but you know, it's pretty close.
Like 20 times.
Yeah, so Mr. Ferguson and I were joking that we ought to adapt everything for online chapel. So rather than I think it's you call me out on the waters, is that what it is? We changed the words to you zoom me out on the waters. We have to watch it over Zoom. You zoom me out onto the waters. Anyway, we were going to go through and change all the praise songs to lyrics to fit COVID, but we didn't get around to it very far. Anyway, make a long story short, we are conditioned by these things. We are conditioned by all sorts of things. Your lives have been lives of conditioning. We condition you with bells. We condition you with grades. Good job, you got an A. Oh, you need to work harder, you have a D. Oh, you have a D and you're not trying very hard, we're going to take away your sports. It's true. So, how many of you agree that we have been very much influenced by our conditioning? Let me see your hands. We've been very much influenced by our conditioning. How many of you think that our morality is based on basically culture and conditioning? Okay, next step. If this is true, what is the purpose of morality? The purpose of morality, very clearly, is to fit into culture. This is why we spend so much time conditioning you, right? So that you guys fit in, so that we have a cohesive culture that makes some degree of sense. And so there's the encouragement. Listen to your culture and the conditioning, and do your best to be plastic to the molding forces of our society. How many of you like that? Yep. No? Okay. With that, assignment for Wednesday is to read the next article in the course pack by Stace. It's several pages long. You might need to read it twice. It's a little bit more involved than Herodotus. So that would be my encouragement. Be ready for a little one-question quiz then. Any questions before I let you guys all go? All right. Well, pretend you hear the bell. Feel the conditioning, and then you guys can go, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Au revoir, y'all.